The Ardennes forest in late December 1944 is a landscape of biting iron and suffocating frost. For the weary soldiers of the Wehrmacht, the Watch on the Rhine offensive was supposed to be a final, glorious stroke to shatter the Allied lines. Instead, it has become a grueling march through knee-deep snow, fueled by little more than desperation and dwindling supplies of ersatz, coffee. In a captured American supply depot near St. Vith, a group of German officers examines the spoils of their initial advance. They had been told the Americans were soft, overextended, and reliant on a fragile supply line that would crumble under pressure. But as they pry open the heavy, insulated crates abandoned by the retreating GIs, the mockery in their voices turns to a hollow, haunting silence. Inside, protected from the winter chill by advanced refrigeration, sits a bounty that seems impossible in a theatre of war. 1,000 gallons of fresh, creamy ice cream. To a German military struggling to find fuel for its tanks and bread for its men, this display of casual abundance is more terrifying than any barrage of heavy artillery. By the autumn of 1944, the Second World War had shifted from a contest of tactical brilliance into a brutal war of attrition, a conflict that would ultimately be decided not by the courage of the infantry alone, but by the sheer, crushing weight of industrial logistics. To the German High Command, the situation was becoming increasingly surreal. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted the American soldier as soft, a product of a decadent, pampered democracy who would fold when faced with the hardened, ideological steel of the Wehrmacht. But as the Allied armies clawed their way across France and toward the borders of the Reich, the German officers began to notice a terrifying trend. They weren't just being outfought, they were being outspent and out-supplied on a scale that defied their military understanding. In Berlin, the Ministry of Armaments struggled to keep pace with the devastating Allied strategic bombing campaign. German factories were being moved underground, fuel was being synthesized from coal, and the once mighty Luftwaffe was grounded by a chronic lack of aviation spirit. By late 1944, the German logistical tail was a fraying rope. While the world remembers the Blitzkrieg for its panzers and Stukas, the reality for the average German soldier was far less mechanized. Nearly 80% of the Wehrmacht relied on horse-drawn transport. In the frozen mud of the Western Front, starving horses were often slaughtered for meat, and soldiers were issued ersatz rations, ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns, and bread stretched with sawdust. To these men, war was a struggle for the next crust of bread, a desperate hunt for a lighter of gasoline. Across the front lines, the American reality was fundamentally different. The United States had transformed into the arsenal of democracy, a title that was more than just a slogan. It was a logistical miracle. From the ports of New York and Norfolk, a literal bridge of ships, the Liberty ships, poured millions of tons of equipment into Europe. But it wasn't just the steel and the gunpowder that signaled the coming end of the Reich, it was the secondary items. The Americans didn't just bring tanks. They brought mobile bakeries that could produce thousands of loaves of fresh white bread every hour. They didn't just bring artillery. They brought portable dental clinics, mobile post offices, and refrigerated trucks. This logistical prowess was organized under the massive umbrella of the Communications Zone or QMZ and the legendary Red Ball Express. Following the breakout from Normandy, thousands of American trucks, driven largely by African-American soldiers, operated on a one-way loop, 24 hours a day, to ensure the front line divisions never ran dry. They moved 12,000 tons of supplies daily. This was a level of mobility and abundance that the German mind, accustomed to the rigid scarcity of the European theatre, simply could not process. To a German colonel who had spent 3 years on the Eastern Front, the idea of a military having enough surplus fuel to run trucks solely for the delivery of mail or fresh fruit was a form of psychological warfare in itself. The German leadership, however, remained arrogant. Men like Field Marshal Walther Model and Gerd von Rundstedt believed that the American supply lines were a weakness, a long, bloated tail that could be severed. This was the core logic behind Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Ardennes offensive. The plan was to strike through the thin Allied centre, capture the massive fuel dumps at Liege, and seize the port of Antwerp. The Germans were betting their entire existence on the hope that the Americans were too dependent on their luxuries. They believed that once the flow of cigarettes, chocolate, and gasoline was cut, the American GI would lose his will to fight. They mocked the American reliance on creature comforts, viewing it as a sign of a military that lacked the warrior spirit. What they failed to realize was that for the United States, logistics were not a luxury, they were a weapon. The American ability to maintain the morale of its troops through high-quality food and comforts was a deliberate strategic choice. Secretary of War Henry Stimson and General George Marshall understood that a soldier who received a hot meal and a letter from home was a soldier who remained cognitively sharp and emotionally resilient. This philosophy reached its most extreme and symbolic form in the creation of the floating ice cream parlors and the massive investment in troop welfare. While the German soldier was digging through frozen earth for a shriveled potato, the American soldier was being promised a taste of home, even in the middle of a blizzard. By the time the first German shells fell on the morning of December 16, 1944, the two sides represented two different centuries of warfare. One side was a feudal society mobilized for total war, but choking on its own lack of resources. The other was a modern industrial titan that viewed the delivery of ice cream to the front lines not as an absurdity, but as a standard operating procedure. The clash in the Ardennes would not just be a test of armor and infantry, but a revelation for the German officer corps. They were about to discover that the soft Americans they mocked possessed a level of resourcefulness that turned even their deserts into a declaration of inevitable victory. The strategic superiority of the American military began with the fundamental biology of the soldier. While the German high command viewed the infantryman as a sacrificial element of the state, expected to endure starvation and cold as a mark of ideological purity, the U.S. Army treated its soldiers as high-performance assets that required specific fueling. The American Quartermaster Corps calculated that a soldier in combat required 4,000 calories a day to maintain peak cognitive function. This wasn't just about filling stomachs, it was about maintaining the edge. A soldier who isn't shivering or starving is a soldier who can aim more accurately and react more quickly to an ambush. By prioritizing hot B rations and specialized treats like candy and ice cream, the US ensured its manpower didn't just survive the winter. They operated with a level of energy the exhausted Wehrmacht simply couldn't match. Technologically, the presence of ice cream on a battlefield was a feat of engineering that left German observers speechless. The United States Navy had spent over $1 million, an astronomical sum in 1945, to convert a concrete barge into a floating ice cream factory capable of producing 10 gallons every 7 seconds. On land, the Army deployed mobile refrigeration units that followed the advance of the front lines. These weren't mere luxuries, they were the end products of a sophisticated, cold chain logistics system that required massive amounts of electricity, specialized chemicals for coolant, and insulated transport. For a German officer whose own supply lines relied on horse-drawn wagons and wooden crates, seeing a refrigerated American truck was like seeing technology from another century. It was a visible, tangible proof that the American industrial machine had already solved the problems of survival and was now focused on the problem of comfort. From the enemy's perspective, this abundance was initially viewed with a mixture of contempt and disbelief. German intelligence reports early in the war often described the Americans as the Coca-Cola Army, a dismissive term meant to imply that the U.S. forces were too spoiled by consumerism to withstand the rigors of true combat. German officers believed that the American reliance on these comforts would be their undoing once the harsh reality of the European winter set in. However, as the war progressed, this mockery turned into a deep, pervasive psychological dread. When a captured German lieutenant saw American troops receiving fresh mail, warm turkey, and frozen desserts while his own men were eating sawdust-laden bread, the realization hit home. It wasn't that the Americans were soft. It was that they were so powerful they didn't have to be miserable. The leadership philosophy behind this logistics-heavy approach was spearheaded by General George C. Marshall, who famously stated that morale is a state of mind. Marshall and Eisenhower understood that in a long war of attrition, the psychological health of the soldier was a strategic resource. They created the Special Services Division, tasked specifically with providing entertainment and comforts to the troops. This was a radical departure from traditional European warfare. By investing in things like portable movie projectors and the ice cream barge, American leadership was telling their men that the entire might of the U.S. economy was standing directly behind them. This fostered a sense of being part of an unstoppable carrying system, which stood in stark contrast to the discardable feeling prevalent among the German ranks as their leaders ordered them to hold to the last man. Ultimately, The sheer industrial scale of this effort was the final nail in the coffin of German morale. By 1945, the US military was distributing over 80 million gallons of ice cream to its troops annually. This was not a localized fluke, it was a standardized part of the American war effort. The same factories that built B-24 Liberators were also producing the powdered mixes and freezing units required to keep the ice cream army moving. When German officers finally stood over captured American supply dumps, they didn't just see food, they saw a mathematical certainty. They realized that a nation capable of shipping frozen dairy across 3,000 miles of submarine-infested ocean was a nation that could never be defeated by traditional tactical maneuvers. The mockery died in their throats as they looked at the white, frozen cream, realizing that the war of production had been lost years ago. The turning point did not occur during a grand tactical maneuver or a massive tank engagement. It happened in the quiet, frozen moments of discovery during the siege of Bastogne and the subsequent Allied counter-push. By late December 1944, the German watch on the Rhine had stalled. The elite units of the 5th and 6th Panzer Armies were running dry, their vehicles abandoned in the snow for lack of fuel. It was in this atmosphere of desperation that German reconnaissance teams and officers began to overrun specific American forward supply points, expecting to find the strategic reserves of gasoline and ammunition they so desperately needed to reach the Meuse River. Instead, they found the ice cream parlors. In several sectors near the Belgian border, German officers entered captured US quartermaster depots and were met with a sight that broke their professional resolve. There, amidst the chaos of war, were functioning, portable ice cream machines and insulated containers filled with vanilla and chocolate cream. One captured German officer later recounted the moment he realized the war was truly over. He had spent weeks convincing his men that the Americans were on the brink of collapse, only to find that the starving Americans had enough surplus energy and shipping space to prioritize frozen desserts. The realization was a psychological sledgehammer. To the German command, logistics was a grim calculation of calories and kilometers. To the Americans, logistics was an extension of the American dream. The German officers looked at the ice cream and then at their own soldiers, who were suffering from trench foot and surviving on a handful of frozen grains. They realized they weren't fighting a military that was struggling to survive. They were fighting a civilization that was thriving in the middle of a wasteland. This wasn't just food, it was a display of casual, arrogant power. The most famous instance of this psychological collapse occurred when a group of German prisoners was brought behind the American lines. They were led past a mobile milkshake unit and saw GIs laughing, eating fresh donuts and holding cups of cold ice cream while the temperature was well below freezing. The German commander, a veteran of the Eastern Front, reportedly broke down in tears. It wasn't the tanks that broke him, it was the fact that the Americans could afford to be frivolous while his own country was burning to the ground. As the calendar turned to January 1945, this logistical shock spread through the German ranks like a virus. Reports filtered back to the high command in Berlin that the American supply situation was not a weakness to be exploited, but a wall of steel and sugar that could not be climbed. The mockery that had characterized German attitudes toward the Coca-Cola army in 1942 was replaced by a paralyzing awe. Every time a German soldier found an American K-ration containing a piece of high-quality chocolate or a pack of fresh Lucky Strike cigarettes, the Nazi propaganda of the master race crumbled a little further. The climax of the Western campaign was the total psychological surrender of the German officer corps to the reality of American industrial omnipotence. As the German watch on the Rhine offensive shattered into a chaotic retreat, the psychological barrier that had held the Wehrmacht together began to disintegrate. German soldiers, who had been told for years that the United States was a nation of fragile shopkeepers, began to surrender in unprecedented numbers. By the spring of 1945, the surrender rate reached a staggering pace, with over 300,000 German troops laying down their arms in the Ruhr pocket alone. For many of these men, the primary motivation was no longer ideological. It was a desperate desire to enter the American system, a system they now knew could provide the warmth, food, and basic humanity their own government had long since abandoned. The statistics of the American logistical victory are almost impossible to reconcile with the European experience of war. By the end of 1945, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps had served over 600 million pounds of candy and 20 billion cigarettes to its troops. The ice cream barge, In the Pacific and the mobile units in Europe had become symbols of a new kind of warfare, the War of Plenty. In the final months of the conflict, U.S. logistics were so efficient that fresh mail from the Midwestern United States was reaching foxholes in Germany in as little as 4 days. This created a profound sense of continuity between the home front and the battlefront, a connection the German military had lost as their postal system collapsed and their cities were reduced to rubble. For the German officers who survived the war, the memory of American abundance became a central theme in their post-war memoirs. They wrote of the Materialsschlacht, the battle of materials, but with a specific focus on the psychological weight of American luxury. They noted that the American ability to provide for their men did more to destroy German morale than any single bombing raid. In the PO camps across Europe and the United States, German prisoners were introduced to a diet that was often better than what they had eaten as civilians in pre-war Germany. The sight of white bread, fresh fruit, and, inevitably, ice cream served as a daily reminder of the total defeat of the Nazi industrial and social model. The strategic shift in the aftermath was permanent. The world had witnessed the birth of the logistical superpower. The United States had proven that the ultimate weapon in modern warfare was not necessarily a larger gun or a faster plane, but the ability to project an entire lifestyle across an ocean. This realization led to the post-war restructuring of global power, where American economic might and the soft power of its consumer goods became as influential as its nuclear arsenal. The ruins of the Third Reich stood as a silent witness to the fact that when a nation can weaponize its standard of living, traditional military defiance becomes an exercise in futility. In the quiet clarity of history, the image of a frozen German officer staring in disbelief at a gallon of American ice cream is more than just a curious anecdote of the Second World War. It is a profound testament to the changing nature of human conflict. For centuries, war had been defined by the endurance of suffering, by which side could bleed longer, starve more quietly, and survive on less. The German military tradition was built on this very pillar of Prussian austerity, believing that the spirit of the warrior was forged in the fire of deprivation. But in the snow-choked forests of the Ardennes, that ancient philosophy collided with the relentless reality of the 20th century. The Americans did not just bring a better tank or a faster rifle to the European theater, they brought a new definition of power. They proved that the ultimate military strength is not found in the ability to endure misery, but in the capacity to eliminate it. By treating the comfort of the individual soldier as a strategic priority, the United States turned the American way of life into a kinetic force. The ice cream, the chocolate, and the fresh mail were not merely treats. They were the physical manifestation of a society so organized and so productive that it could export the comforts of home to the very edge of the abyss. This realization fundamentally altered the psychology of the modern world. It signaled the end of the era where total war meant the total impoverishment of the soldier. The German officers who once mocked the Coca-Cola army were forced to confront a bitter truth. They were not being defeated by a soft enemy, but by a superior one. They were being overwhelmed by a nation that viewed the impossible as a logistical challenge and luxury as a baseline requirement. It was the moment the master race was forced to admit that the arsenal of democracy had not only outproduced them in steel but had outmatched them in the very care of the human soul. Today, that ice cream barge and the mobile field kitchens of 1944 remain symbols of a unique American philosophy of warfare. They remind us that the most terrifying thing to an enemy is not a military that fights, because it has nothing to lose, but a military that fights with the full, unyielding weight of its civilization behind it. As we look back at the ruins of the mid-century, we see that the war was not won by grit alone. It was won by the realization that in the face of a nation that can ship 1 million gallons of ice cream across a war-torn ocean, surrender is not just an option, it is the only logical conclusion. The echoes of that logistical miracle still resonate in modern strategy, proving that while battles are won by soldiers, wars are decided by the sheer, unstoppable force of a nation's reach. In the end, the German officers didn't just lose a campaign, they witnessed the birth of a superpower that understood that the greatest weapon in the world is the ability to provide for its own.